All right, I want to do a quick run through of chapter 17 and give you some of the basics that you need to be looking through or looking for as you do your reading. Uh, there actually is several big things that you need to be looking at as you work your way through this chapter. Okay, let's look at the objectives real quick. Obviously, from looking at this page, that you can see the first two things that the chapter really is concerned with is the development of the Ottoman Empire and the development of the Safavid Empire. These two are they're Muslim empires. They we used to, in times past, used to refer to them sometimes as the gunpowder empires because they would be one of the first European empires to, or Middle Eastern and spreading up into Europe, want to be the some of the first to use gunpowder and use it militarily in a militaristic way. So the Ottoman Empire and the Safavid Empire is really where you begin. The Ottoman Empire, modern day Turkey; Safavid Empire, modern day Iran. And so those are the two places that you're sort of looking for there. Uh, from there, you're going to move out of that and take a look at really the development of several major things in Europe. You're going to take a look at the Habsburg family. You're going to take a look at religious problems in France and England. You're going to look at some of the situation going on in Russia and kind of finish up talking about the balance of power in Europe. It's a big chapter. It's an important chapter. So let's kind of delve through this really quickly. And I want to kind of point out some of the highlights that you need to be looking for as you do your reading. Uh, the the Ottoman Empire is a Muslim empire that will grow during this period, expand during this period, and out of its where its really ancestral home is in what is today modern day Turkey. The Ottomans will expand, and you can see they expand to Syria, to Egypt, to Iraq, taking up most of those places into the Black Sea area, Greece as well. And eventually they'll begin to push north once they take control of what used to be Constantinople, and they will rename it Istanbul. They will then begin to push into parts of southeastern Europe. To build this kind of an empire, the Ottoman Empire had to be pretty good militarily, and it was. So they had a powerful navy, especially early on, and fast moving and fairly skilled cavalry troops. The uh, the Ottoman Empire was centered on a ruling person, a ruling individual named a sultan. Sultans oftentimes had to, because they were so powerful. You see this happen in China too. That they had to deal with rivals for their power constantly. And so, while sometimes it's easy to trust members of your family, it's also easy for members of your family to try to take advantage of you and steal away your power. And because of that, the Ottomans began to rely on non family members in their administration. Some of these were slaves and they were recruited, sometimes kidnapped from places where the Ottoman Empire expanded into, especially into southeastern Europe. Sometimes they were Christians who young children who would be kidnapped from families, taken back to the Ottoman Empire, re-educated, converted to Islam, and then raised essentially as military people. That sounds terrible, and it was. But those children eventually would hold a very elite place in Ottoman society. They were some of the closest people to the Sultan because, since they were slaves, they could be trusted more than, say, the Sultan's family members. So these Janissaries, which it's really a terrible translation. it should have been Janissary, and it becomes Janissaries. But anyway, they are the ones that become these military elites that surround the Sultan and do the Sultan's bidding. The Here you can see they would be a very elite group, and of course you can see here they would be using gunpowder as well. So this is a scene from where the Ottomans were laying siege to Vienna. The Ottoman expansion also made them powerful because religiously they controlled three of the holy cities, the three most holy cities in Islam: Mecca, where the Kaaba is; Medina, the city of the Prophet, where Muhammad and Islam really began to win over its first converts; and Jerusalem, where the Dome of the Rock is, because that's the place where Muhammad ascended into heaven. And so these all became pilgrimage sites. And so the Ottomans actually began to use this to their advantage. And since they're pilgrimage sites, people coming there all the time, it became part of the Islamic economy, especially the Ottoman economy. You'll The text will talk to you a little bit about some of the most important of the Ottoman leaders. There's no probably one more important than Suleiman the Magnificent, and you can read a little bit about him and some of the things that he did. But he is certainly the most powerful of the Ottoman Empire's sultans. Okay, major building programs, extremely powerful sultan, a lot of almost Ottoman Renaissance going on, a lot of art, building, culture. Okay, uh, very open and really very favorable to even other groups like Christians and Jews, allowing them to trade, and to do so, only managed to benefit the Ottoman economy. The So this is a picture of Suleiman. Okay. Uh, the biggest problem is that as the Ottoman Empire began to push out and began to conquer some of these other areas, they became a threat, and they push into southeastern Europe. They attack Vienna, and will be turned back by the Austrians uh, because they became a threat. The Europeans didn't want them expanding anywhere, and so they oftentimes campaigned pretty actively to keep the Ottomans out of specific areas, okay, including sometimes allying with the Safavids. Now, right across the border from what is today modern day Iraq, as you cross over the border into what is today modern day Iran, you would also find that border becoming the border of Safavid Iran. All right, the Safavids are a different group of people. They are a They're a group of people that in the 1500s, led by Ismail, would move in and conquer Persia, taking Persia. This is an Islamic group that would take Persia away from, well, technically the Persians, but they would also be, even though we call the Safavid Empire a Muslim empire, and it is, the Safavids were a different form of Islam. They are Shiites. The Shia of Ali, or the Shiite Sunni split, goes all the way back to really the days after the death of Muhammad. There was a controversy in the days after Muhammad's death where one group believed that Muhammad had chosen one of his family members, Ali, to succeed him, which was not the popular opinion. The popular opinion, which becomes the Sunni opinion and becomes Sunni Islam, was that Muhammad had simply said, choose one from among the elders to succeed him, and that is actually what happened. The first caliph, the first deputy after Muhammad's death, was Abu Bakr, not Ali. Now, eventually, Ali would become caliph, but also be murdered as well. And there is a pretty serious split between Shiite Islam and Sunni Islam that even continues to today. The Safavids were, though, once they gained control of Persia, they were in a kind of a crossroads of trade. To the east, you had India and China. To, of course, the west, you had the Ottoman Empire and then Europe. And so lots of very valuable merchandise passed its way through Safavid territory. Safavid Iran also would go on to become a major exporter of various things, but rugs was one of the most important, and tile too as well. The Ottomans and the Safavids never got along with one another, and as a result, there is usually some form of disagreement between these two groups, and they seem to always kind of be at war with one another. The height of the Safavid Empire comes under Abbas the First. Okay, it's when Isfahan really becomes the major capital, and it was a kind of the really the high point of Safavid Iran. But after his death in 1629, the last Safavid rulers were pretty awful, and as a result, Safavid Iran will decline after 1629. Both empires will suffer as you got into the 1600s and 1700s. The Safavid Empire is going to collapse, and by about 1722, Safavid Iran was doomed. Uh, the Ottoman Empire will persist, all right, and it will continue all the way until you get into the early 1900s, technically. But it will always sort of, after really about the middle of the 1600s, sort of be in decline. The Ottomans tried to attack Vienna again and failed. Okay, and even though they forced Austria to give up some of the land in the Balkans, the Ottoman Empire is never going to be able to hold that. They become more defensive, they will sink back, and eventually they're going to suffer. Now, for a while, they will do okay. One of the reasons that they will do okay is that the Ottomans are going to draw closer to Europe rather than sort of alienating themselves as a a state that is totally reliant on Islam, or that just walls itself off. You will see the Ottoman Empire embrace really the the European markets, and that's why their agriculture and their commerce will remain high. Okay, and they will really remain sort of prosperous despite really some really big problems. One of the biggest things, though, is when you get to the late 1800s, early 1900s, they're going to find themselves on the wrong end of history. They're going to support Germany, for example, during World War One, and that will doom the Ottoman Empire. The uh, the next thing the book talks a little bit about is Sufism, and where Sufism is a mystical form of Islam, right? And it's a little bit different. So make sure you read a little bit about Sufism and that development in Islam. And then I told you that the book kind of takes this shift here and moves you into Western Europe, where you talk about the Habsburg dynasty, one of the most powerful families in 16th, 17th, early 18th century Europe. The Habsburg family will be on some of the most powerful thrones in Europe, and so getting to know the Habsburgs is one of the things that you probably ought to do. The book takes you to the reign of Charles the First, who was the Holy Roman Empire. The Holy Roman Emperor, excuse me, the Holy Roman Empire was what is today Germany. Okay, Germany didn't exist in 1520. It was a conglomeration of states called the Holy Roman Empire. And Charles I was a Habsburg who becomes the Holy Roman Emperor in 1520, just about the time that Martin Luther and the Reformation began. The next step, and this is the map of the spread of the Protestant Reformation, which we talked a little bit and you've read a little bit about already. And make sure that you, of course, know who Martin Luther is and what he taught. Another Habsburg rules over Spain, and Philip II will rule over really the Spanish Empire, which we'll talk about in the next chapter. Okay, so you'll get to meet Philip II and the Spanish Empire that he ruled over up close and personal the next time. You'll kind of see how Philip would push his luck, and he will go after the Netherlands, and that will lead to really the Dutch becoming politically independent of Spanish control after the 30 Years' War, which lasted from 1618 to 1648. Philip was not very pleased with the developments of Protestantism in England under Henry VIII. And in 1588, he tried to invade England and was defeated by the English Navy and the Spanish Armada. The Spanish Armada was a disaster. He wanted, of course, to remove Elizabeth I, who was Queen of England at that time, and he fails miserably, and it leads to, really, in one way, leads to a change in the power structure because, really, from as you get into the 1600s, England's going to be on the uptick while Spain is going to be in decline. You'll be introduced a little bit to the 30 Years' War, which I mentioned a little bit earlier, and then you will kind of take a closer look at Protestantism in France, where you kind of understand who John Calvin was and the problems that that Protestantism endured in France as it spread into France out of Germany. Calvin was really a follower of Luther, but was a little bit different. Has some different ideas that you probably need to be aware of. Uh, what this leads to, though, is the French king to solve some of these religious controversies will start to become more and more powerful, and the power will begin to centralize around the French monarch. Now, this really happens under the reign of Louis XIII, who chose Cardinal Richelieu here as his prime minister. And you can see that Richelieu was determined to make France's monarchy more powerful. So Richelieu ruled, very powerfully. After Louis XIII died, the new king, Louis XIV, who was very young when he became king, and really can't rule for himself, you see France almost devolve into a civil war. But eventually, Louis XIV is going to become old enough to rule for himself, and Louis XIV is going to become the most powerful king in Europe the by the time that he's old enough to rule for himself. He will become really the perfect example of what we consider to be an absolute monarchy, a king that has total and complete power, who controls the economy, who controls the military. And so, as you sort of understand that Louis becomes the most powerful king, he's also very Catholic. And as a result, he will revoked the Edict of Nantes, which allowed for French Protestants to worship freely in France. To be Once that is revoked, you'll see an exodus of French Protestants. Many of them will come to America, by the way. The So you see there's Louis the 14th. You'll shift gears and take a look at what's going on in England. Henry VIII took England out of the Catholic Church so that he could get a divorce, and because he was obsessed with having a male child. Uh, Eventually, though, his offspring become very important. No one more important than his daughter Elizabeth, who will rule England for a good portion of this time period. England becomes more and more Protestant as a result. And like I told you, because England is able to defeat uh, Spain at the during the Spanish Armada in 1588, then uh, England is going to be on the rise, while, of course, unfortunately, Spain is not. The During this period, you'll also be introduced to the two times that England tries, or at least English monarchs try to become like Louis in France, absolute monarchs. English monarchs are going to try twice to become absolute, and they're going to be rejected both times. The first time, it causes a civil war from 1642 to 1649. Parliament and parliamentary armies will be led by Oliver Cromwell, who will defeat Charles I and execute Charles I in 1649. For a brief period, Parliament will rule England without a king. So until about 1658 when Cromwell dies, and then Parliament decides to bring back the monarchy in 1660. The Charles had wanted to rule as an absolute monarch, had moved in that direction. Parliament resisted, and it led to this civil war. It did lead to the execution of the king, though. And so, what the English basically come out of this saying is that we really want to keep our representative body, Parliament, and we are not going to allow any monarch to become absolute. The next time anybody tries this, they're going to end up like Charles. Monarchy is restored in 1660, and Charles II and then James II will rule England. They both will try to move England more towards an absolute monarchy again. And this time, rather than have a civil war, you have an overthrow. James II in 1688 will be booted from the throne. An invasion takes place, and one of James's relatives his daughter Mary, and her husband William of Orange from the Netherlands will boot James out of England and will be recognized as the new monarchs in England. In 1689, William will sign the Bill of Rights, and that makes England a constitutional or a limited monarchy. So in Europe, you have these two styles that develop: absolute monarchy and constitutional monarchy. And Louis is the best example of the absolute, and of course, uh, England will be the best example of a limited or a constitutional monarchy. All right, from here, you take a look at the rise of Russia. You'll learn about Ivan the Terrible. You'll learn about the Romanov dynasty that develops after the time of troubles after Ivan the Terrible's death. You'll learn about Peter the Great, who will launch a major reformation program in Russia, bringing Russia kicking and screaming into the more modern age, including building the Winter Palace. After kind of going through this section about the Jewish diaspora, which you can read, And you end up here in this last little section that talks about the balance of power and how Britain and France become global powers. And of course, we're going to set that up because they will be competing all over the globe with one another. Lastly, this is kind of the last thing we'll talk about. The textbook throws a couple of smaller kingdoms at you, including Prussia and Austria. They are important. Just kind of make sure that you look at them as you go through that last part of the textbook. And this kind of shows you the map at where we are in about 1750 or so. And you can see the Holy Roman Empire here, which is going to become Germany. But right up here will be Prussia. Okay, Austria is right down here, and so you're going to start to see these kingdoms become a little bit more and more powerful. All right, I hope that helps. Hope that gives you a little bit of a guideline here to go through. Okay, and as you read your chapter, make sure you sort of focus on some of those areas. All right.